In the UK, the issue of land and how it is owned and managed underlies a number of challenges, including flood management, environmental restoration, and agriculture. As the UK transitions away from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, a new environmental land management scheme will pay farmers public money for public goods. Smaller farms will be more vulnerable to this transition given the substantial reduction to their income. To reconfigure England's historically accumulated landscape, we argue that transforming agriculture itself is necessary. This thesis recognizes the unequal distribution of land in England as the consequence of the ideology of private property and its development in the history of English land reform. Specifically, we address the need for a more ecologically and socially sustainable distribution of land in line with the Green New Deal, one that promotes agro-ecology and land sovereignty, or the right to have access to and control over land and the benefits of its use, regardless of ownership. The current distribution of land can be understood by addressing how historical land reforms fragmented and consolidated the English landscape over time, often reflecting social stratification with continuously increasing privatization during the enclosure period. An idyllic, measured and scenic landscape is created by manipulating the land to produce an image of productivity and abundance. The construction of landscape and paintings increasingly appealed to the tastes of the wealthy and the nouveau riche, who affixed aesthetics of power, control, and capital to their land. The disappearance of the commons accompanied the rise of capitalist individualism and the notion of private land ownership. During the feudal period, peasants were bound by law to work on the land, while land was owned by lords. Enclosure acts resulted in increasingly partitioned land, which were consolidated into large holdings and disappearing common land that is privately owned but open to a certain community of commoners. With industrialization, the privatization of land fragmented the countryside, which increasingly became displays of wealth. New liberalism further intensified the individualist mindset as the landscape became rapidly urbanized and exploited for profits. Today, 1% of farmers own 17% of the farmland in England. Pictured in dark red are the largest farms. The majority of the farms are too small to receive subsidies under the current policy. Landowners with large agricultural land holdings occupy the most fertile agricultural areas shown in darker blue. Large farms often achieve outstanding economic productivity, but by using environmentally destructive farming methods. Industrial monoculture farming upsets the soils and intensifies the use of fertilizers and pesticides, causing damages to the environment and its carbon sequestration. A shift to more diverse polyculture crop types and environmental restoration is needed. The transition away from the cap, however, poses challenges for smaller farmers. The heavily criticized cap area-based basic payments will be abolished gradually, despite constituting a large proportion of farmers' income. The basic payment scheme and the countryside stewardship scheme, which provides grants to protect and restore farming environments, will be replaced by the environmental land management scheme. However, the amount of money farmers will receive from the AALM is not comparable to the amount of the BPS, and smaller farmers will likely suffer the most. As the Landworkers Alliance argues, without a robust mechanism or set of criteria, any new land will be consolidated under existing large landowners who have the capital and the resources to outcompete new entrants and land-based social enterprises. This means that a new entrant support scheme and priority support for small farms is necessary. We'll closely examine how farmers are currently navigating this transition to the ALM and ultimately propose a collaborative transition strategy that draws from existing strategies. The campaign for a new entrant's agro-ecological startup scheme, the establishment of community land trusts, and the farmer cluster model. Our design thesis focuses on agrarian land reform in the UK to support farmers and to change the way land is managed and farmed. We propose a framework of local collaboration to support agro-ecological, small-scale farming and the resilience of farming communities. Our proposal builds upon the existing precedent of farmer clusters, a farmer-led initiative that responds to challenges produced by an unjust system of land ownership that spans centuries. We'll later take this model further to a transition towards recreating the commons, more accessible and community-owned land. As a case study, we examined the Martindown Farmer Cluster, formed in 2016. Martindown is one of 3 clusters that constitute the Martindown Supercluster, centered around a nature reserve. These clusters, led by one anchor farm, work together to increase woodland, connect habitats, and other environmental strategies. These 2 farms within the cluster work together to plant grass and flower margins and wild birdseed plots for wildlife to move between conservation areas. Martindown is among 122 farmer clusters in England. These are funded by community trusts, private donors, and the Natural England Facilitation Fund. This fund in particular led to the creation of the first farmer clusters. This grant requires a minimum area of 2,000 hectares to encourage the formation of clusters. This model of collaboration can join small farms together, forming a network that is more economically and ecologically resilient than individual farms operating alone. We brought this strategy to the site we identified as having a high potential for successful and regenerative collaboration. We identified 16 sample farms from various sustainable farming networks across England to act as anchor farms connecting with neighboring farmlands. By assessing size, environmental qualities, and demographic status, we identified Willowbrook Farm to implement further sustainable strategies upon. Located in between 7 existing farmer clusters in Oxfordshire, the site could connect with local clusters at a regional level. These existing clusters are located within nature reserves. The farmlands in the Willowbrook area have a divided ownership status, with the average farm size significantly below the national average. We propose these potential clusters in the region based on shared characteristics. Each cluster obtains individual targets such as infrastructure improvement and environmental restoration. Our design investigates the area centered around Willowbrook Farm. As a proposed anchor farm in the cluster, Willowbrook has already implemented sustainable practices with a range of livestock and diverse farming practices. However, some of the neighboring farms continue to practice monocropping. As a cluster, they could incrementally transition the environmental condition at a greater scale. This transition is also ideological, to shift away from the dominant neoliberal ideology of individualism and private ownership and towards a more collectivist model of land stewardship and mutual exchange. Not every landowner would be willing to open up their land or work with their neighbors. By providing a handbook and resources to start a cluster and a visualization tool for farmers, we can facilitate more efficient collaboration between farmers and illustrate the benefits and trade-offs of participation. We gathered feedback from farmers on issues with land management and existing agriculture policy. The 2 main issues in this transition were to increase productivity while remaining sustainable and the need for a bottom-up transition to redistribute land and level the playing field. We looked at 2 case studies of farms that are already implementing environmental strategies to gain insight on how they are navigating the post-CAP transition to increase or sustain productivity, manage soil quality, and connect wildlife habitats. A network of trees and environmental corridors interlinks across the farms. Arable fields are divided into smaller parcels, while remaining accessible for harvesting machineries. Mixed cropping techniques are applied to improve diversity, productivity, and soil quality. Environmental corridors such as a beetle bank could be inserted in a large crop field to allow insects to inhabit the strip. The activities of these species in the crop field improve soil fertility and yield. The 2 farms that successfully implemented environmental strategies both highlighted the imperative to collaborate with locals in achieving greater environmental ambitions. The uncertainty and lack of vision that constrains the ability of farmers is what this handbook seeks to address. We propose 4 stages of transition: connection, cluster, stewardship, and commons, incorporating aspects of nature restoration, crop diversity, infrastructure, and community. Farmers start sharing knowledge and tools to diversify their produce at level 1. Level 2 requires 20% of land being shared. Community ownership is reached at level 3 with a stronger emphasis on land sharing and environmental strategies, and a portion of common land is dedicated for training for new farming entrants. At level 4, a land trust is set up for purchasing new land so that the collective effort could deliver further development plans. We propose a user platform for farmers to visualize opportunity areas and margins running between their land and that of neighboring farms. This platform would take as input the user's drawing of crop margins and trees and subsequently generate an image. By visualizing opportunity areas for collaboration, farmers can better communicate their landscape ideas with neighbors. To fund this transition at each stage, we examined public schemes that could benefit smaller farmers if they collaborate, most notably the Natural Income Facilitation Fund. However, this fund, part of the Countryside Stewardship Program, will be phased out and replaced by the ELM. The ELM began its first programs this year and will be scaled up after 2024. Depending on the level of engagement, the ELM rewards farmers for managing their land sustainably. Smaller farms, however, have less land and less capital to undertake major rewilding projects. At each stage, we identified a number of actions and their potential grants. The first stage is to form connections between neighboring farms and discuss the potential and benefits of forming a cluster. The next stage involves seeking funding, identifying an anchor farm, and forming a cluster with a framework of common strategies. The farmers we surveyed expressed concern that the ELM will not provide near enough funding as the BPS and Countryside Stewardship, meaning that they will have to make budget cuts while increasing productivity and look for alternative sources of funding. To receive more funding from existing grants, farmers will have to work together. At the second stage, forming a cluster will allow small farmers to pool resources and undertake environmental projects collaboratively. Successful projects and more advanced strategies will result in a higher sum of public grants received. At this time, the implementation of a new entrants agro-ecological startup scheme is crucial. DEFRA is currently developing this scheme in consultation with farmers and working groups who are campaigning to ensure smaller farms and young entrants are prioritized. At this critical stage in the transition, the cluster should begin to consider more resilient strategies, including sharing land for rotational grazing and cropping. The third stage in this transition involves the beginning of the formation of community land trusts. Using the existing cluster as the organizational structure, farmers can transfer the land holdings into a common trust in which all member farms hold shares. This is beneficial for undertaking cluster-wide strategies across farm boundaries. After pooling their land, resources, and funds, the CLT may also find a suitable site that farmers agree would be better managed by the cluster themselves to benefit them and the local community and purchase this land. At the fourth stage, the cluster connects with neighboring clusters to share common strategies and knowledge and to potentially form a supercluster. Clusters can develop a joint business plan expanding their common lands. Clusters can also use existing or newly acquired shared land to support new entrants and collaborate to create a local farmers market. Ultimately, by the fourth stage of this transition, participating farms will have created networks between conservation areas, shifted from individual ownership to stewardship of the commons, and created more open access land. Lastly, we'll visualize how these four stages of transition will be realized spatially at the Willowbrook site and the landscape transformations at each level, from cluster to supercluster to commons. With land sharing, new crops can be introduced by growing over boundaries adjacent to neighbors. The existing crop distribution pattern of monocrop practices can be diversified through cross-boundary collaborations. Farmers can exchange knowledge and facilities to collectively diversify crops over previous boundaries for more efficient management. Adjacent grazing areas can also be managed together to undertake rotational grazing, as well as implementing agroforestry grazing to restore environmental qualities such as soil health. Infrastructure can be improved from local to main roads. Similarly, facilities can be scaled up from grazing sheds to a communal center. Improvement to minor roads can also improve connectivity. With community ownership, new land can be purchased and a portion can be dedicated for new farming entrants with facilities such as sheds for rotational grazing over shared land. The Level 4 cluster could obtain a centralized public area for tourism and education, as well as improving connections to nearby towns with new roads. The environmental strategies consist of three criteria: topography, flooding, and natural networks. Steep topographical areas should be reforested as is unsuitable for cropping. Restoring the riverbank can also contribute to flooding prevention. Scattered existing woodlands, hedges, and corridors can be connected to promote biodiversity and continuity. With such gradual environmental restoration, farmers can collectively deliver strategies at a landscape scale to receive more grants such as countryside stewardship. By building on the cluster model, the Willowbrook site in Oxfordshire can form a more resilient farming community during the post-CAP transition, protecting smaller farms from being sold off to large landowners while creating the new commons, land that is managed collectively regardless of ownership, such that the local community can benefit from its resources. This transition at Willowbrook is a local-scale model for a landscape transformation at a national scale, involving the formation of a supercluster corridor across the English countryside. This transformation has the potential to expand land-based social enterprises from small individual farms to community-managed commons with their own local market, supplying land access to the next generation. We envision a supercluster corridor that functions across the regional and national scale, connecting isolated woodlands and habitats while ensuring the well-being of rural communities. These buffer zones around existing clusters represent surrounding areas that could benefit from joining in collaboration or forming a cluster themselves, what could later constitute the national supercluster corridor. This transition on a national scale will be a protracted landscape transformation, as well as an ideological one. Taking examples of rewilding and agro-ecological practice from precedent case studies, we visualized how the region can shift from a fragmented and privatized landscape to one that is collectively managed regardless of ownership, constituting the new commons. As this gradual transition takes place on a larger scale, the Farmer's Handbook for Recreating the Commons will expand to include notes from practice, new policies, and new strategies. Ultimately, this project aims to demonstrate the opportunity for the UK to finally address the issue of land, to entirely transform agriculture in the UK to confront the climate crisis, and undertake a socially and environmentally just redistribution of the English landscape.